She had been a ghost in that hospital for 2 years. Quiet, competent, invisible. The kind of nurse the staff stepped around without noticing, the kind Dr. Victor Sloan liked to use as an example of everything he found mediocre. When he mocked her in front of the entire emergency department, the room laughed. Some of them felt bad about it later. Most didn't. Emily Carter bent down, picked up her clipboard, and said nothing. She had learned a long time ago that the people who talk the loudest in a room are almost never the most dangerous ones in it. 30 seconds later, the ambulance bay doors exploded open, and a man with blood soaking through his tactical vest lurched into the ER, locked eyes on her from across the room, and snapped to rigid attention. "Major Carter," he said, his voice cracking but certain. "Permission to stand down." The room went so quiet you could hear the IV drip. If you've stayed this far, stay to the end. This story is just getting started. Follow along, hit like, and drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Stone Harbor was the kind of mid-sized coastal city that liked to believe it mattered more than it did. The kind of place with one decent waterfront, 2 decent restaurants, and a regional medical center that called itself a trauma hub because it was the only hospital within 40 miles that had a CT scanner and a helipad. Ravencrest Regional Medical Center had 340 beds, a reputation it worked hard to protect, and a trauma director who had built his entire career on the assumption that no one would ever look too closely at how he ran his department. Emily Carter had worked the evening shift in the ER for 22 months. She was 34 years old, 5'6", with the kind of posture that came from years of standing at attention and the kind of eyes that tracked a room the way a person does when they've spent time in places where missing something could get people killed. She didn't talk about that. She'd learned quickly that it didn't go over well. The one time she'd mentioned her service record in her first month, a charge nurse named Deborah had smiled politely and said, "Oh, we don't really do things the military way here." So she stopped mentioning it. She did her job. She kept her head down. She documented everything. The ER at Ravencrest wasn't a bad place to work, technically. The equipment was decent, the support staff was competent, and the patient volume was manageable except during summer weekends when the boating accidents rolled in. What made it hard was Dr. Victor Sloan. Sloan was 51, gray at the temples, and moved through the department with the particular confidence of a man who had never once been seriously challenged. He had trained at a program that no longer ranked in the top 20, had published a handful of papers that no one cited, and had somehow leveraged a friendship with the hospital's chief of medicine into the trauma director position 8 years ago. Since then, he had systematically removed anyone who made him feel uncomfortable, promoted people who agreed with him reflexively, and cultivated a reputation as the standard against which all emergency care at Ravencrest was measured. He had taken a dislike to Emily Carter within 2 weeks of her arrival. She wasn't sure exactly what triggered it. Maybe it was the way she moved, efficient, economical, no wasted motion. Maybe it was the way she never looked impressed when he spoke. Whatever it was, Sloan had decided she was a problem, and he expressed that decision in the way small men usually do, through 100 small cruelties administered in public. He called her the clipboard nurse. He interrupted her assessments in front of patients. He overruled her triage decisions loudly, and then explained in slow, patient tones why she'd been wrong, even when she hadn't been. He had a habit of saying, with all due respect to the nursing staff, before doing something that had no respect in it at all. On a Tuesday evening in October, he finally went too far. The patient was a 63-year-old man named Gerald Whitmore, who had come in presenting with what looked, on the surface, like a straightforward case of hypertensive urgency. His blood pressure was dangerously elevated, he was flushed, and he was complaining of a headache behind his left eye. The attending on duty, a second-year resident named Dr. Priya Okafor, had started him on a standard protocol. Emily had checked his chart, done her own assessment, and noticed something that made the back of her neck tighten. She found Dr. Okafor at the nursing station. "I want to flag something on Whitmore," she said, keeping her voice neutral. "His pain pattern and the way he's guarding his left shoulder, I don't think this is just hypertensive urgency. I think we should rule out aortic dissection." Okafor was young and overwhelmed, but she was smart. She listened. "You think we need a CT?" I think we should at least get an EKG and check his pulse differential before we go further with the BP management. If there's a dissection and we push the nitroprusside too aggressively, that's a significant concern, Okafor said. Let you what? Dr. Sloane's voice came from behind them both. Emily turned. He was standing at the edge of the nursing station with his arms crossed and his expression arranged in the specific way it got when he wanted an audience, which he had. 3 nurses, 2 residents, and a medical student were all within earshot. Nurse Carter was flagging a concern about Whitmore in Bay 6, Emily said. I believe the presentation may warrant ruling out. Aortic dissection, Sloane said. Yes, I heard. He smiled. And what is your medical degree from, exactly? The room got very quiet. I don't have a medical degree, Emily said, but the patient's pulse is being managed by physicians, Sloane said, not nurses who watch too many medical dramas. He picked up the chart from the station and made a show of reviewing it. Hypertensive urgency, standard presentation. Dr. Okafor, continue with the protocol. Okafor looked at Emily. Emily gave a small, controlled nod. There was nothing else to do. She walked back to Bay 6 to check on Whitmore. His color was slightly worse. She documented her observations with timestamps and specific language, the way she always did, the way she'd been trained to in a field hospital outside Kandahar, when documentation was the difference between an incident and a cover-up. She checked his radial pulse on both sides. The difference was subtle, but it was there. She found the charge nurse, a man named Paul Renfrew, who had been at Ravencrest for 11 years and who had, over the past several months, become the closest thing Emily had to an ally in the department. Paul, she said quietly, I need you to know I've flagged and documented a concern about Whitmore in Bay 6. Pulse differential, left shoulder guarding, pain pattern inconsistent with pure hypertension. Paul looked at her for a moment. You want me to back you up if this goes sideways? I want the documentation to exist before it goes sideways. She paused. I also want someone else who's aware. He nodded slowly. Okay? She went back to work. An hour later, Whitmore's blood pressure dropped suddenly, and he began complaining that the pain in his back was much worse. Emily was already moving when the monitor alarmed. She called the rapid response, and when the team arrived, she gave them her assessment in the clipped, precise language she'd learned in another life. Timeline, vitals, differential, intervention priority. Dr. Okafor ordered the CT. The scan showed a type A aortic dissection that would have killed Gerald Whitmore within the hour if the BP protocol had continued unchecked. He went up to the OR. He survived. Sloane said nothing to Emily that night. He waited 2 days. The next time their shifts overlapped, he called a brief departmental huddle before rounds and used it to announce a review of nursing scope overreach incidents, a phrase he had apparently invented for the occasion. He didn't say Emily's name. He didn't have to. Every person in that room knew exactly who he was talking about, and most of them looked at the floor. This department runs on clear professional hierarchy, he said. When support staff second-guess clinical decisions, it creates noise. It creates liability, and frankly, it creates a culture problem. We're a team, but teams have structure. He looked at Emily directly for exactly 2 seconds, then looked away. I trust everyone understands that. After the huddle broke, Emily stood at the medication dispensary and let herself feel for exactly 30 seconds the specific exhaustion of being in a place where doing your job correctly made you a target. Then she put it away and went back to work. The confrontation, when it finally happened, was in the hallway outside Bay 4 on a Thursday evening. It was over a pediatric patient, a 7-year-old girl named Mia who had come in with a fever of 104.6, an altered mental status that everyone in triage had logged as likely viral illness. Emily had done the intake, and something about the kid's neck was wrong. Not dramatically, not obviously, but wrong in a way that made her hands go still for a moment. She pulled the attending aside. The attending was Dr. James Bauer, a hospitalist covering the ER that shift, competent but conservative. She told him what she'd observed. He nodded, ordered a lumbar puncture to rule out meningitis. It was the right call. Sloane was walking past when the order went in. Bauer, his voice was pleasant. Lumbar puncture on a pediatric febrile patient. Walk me through your thinking, Bauer explained. At some point, the conversation shifted to Emily, who had initiated the concern. Nurse Carter, Sloan said. Again. The presentation has some atypical features, she said. Nuchal rigidity on flexion, though subtle. Given the fever trajectory and the mental status, did you go to medical school? You've asked me that before. Something shifted in his face. Not anger exactly, but something colder. I'm asking again because I keep having to explain the same concept. You are a nurse. You do not diagnose. You report. You assist. You do not initiate workups. You do not redirect physician decisions, and you do not create unnecessary anxiety in my department by playing doctor with a 7-year-old's chart. The hallway had people in it. Several of them stopped. Mia's LP came back, Paul Renfrew's voice came from the nursing station. He was holding a printout. His face was completely controlled. Bacterial meningitis. The silence that followed was the specific silence of people recalculating. Sloane's jaw moved once. He said nothing. Emily said nothing either. She turned and went to Mia's bay because there was work to do and a child who needed it. That should have been the end of it. It wasn't. Sloane filed a formal complaint against Emily 2 days later, alleging scope violations, repeated insubordination, and disruption of clinical workflow. She was called into a meeting with the nursing director, a careful woman named Constance Park, who had spent 23 years not making enemies. The meeting lasted 40 minutes. Park was apologetic in the way people are when they've already made a decision and are performing the courtesy of an explanation. We value everything you bring to this department, Park said, but Dr. Sloane's concerns have been documented, and at this point it's become a structural issue. We're going to need to make a change. A change, Emily said. Your current shift assignment isn't working. We'd like to transition you to a float pool position, which would remove me from this ER, Emily said. Park's hands folded over each other on the desk. It would give you more flexibility. Emily looked at her for a moment. There was no point in being angry. Anger in a room like this was just something that got used against you. I want to complete my current shift, she said, and I want my personnel file to reflect this meeting and the circumstances surrounding it. Park hesitated, then nodded. Emily went back to the ER. It was 6:40 p.m. Her shift ended at 11. She had slightly over 4 hours left in a department where she'd spent 22 months doing everything right and had somehow still managed to make herself a liability. She was at the medication cart when Sloane stopped beside her. He didn't look at her. He was reading something on his phone. Your last shift on this unit is tonight, he said, almost conversationally. I'd like security to walk you out at the end of your shift. Departmental policy for transitions. There was no departmental policy for that. They both knew it. Understood, Emily said. She went back to her patients. At 7:15, Paul found her in the supply room. He closed the door partway. You doing all right? I'm fine. Emily. She looked up. He had the expression of someone who had watched this happen before and felt lousy about their part in not stopping it. The thing with Mia, he said, and the Whitmore guy last week. That was good medicine. I'm a nurse, she said. I don't do medicine. He winced slightly. You know what I mean. I know. She handed him a bag of IV supplies. I'm fine, Paul. I have 4 hours left. I'm going to do them well. He held the supply bag and didn't move. For whatever it's worth, this is wrong. A lot of things are wrong, she said. Doesn't usually stop them from happening. She was at the triage desk at 7:52 p.m. when she heard it, the sound that takes a moment to identify if you haven't heard it in years and then becomes completely unmistakable. Multiple rotor systems. Not one helicopter, not the standard medevac single. Multiple. She straightened without quite knowing why. The radio at the ambulance bay crackled. The charge dispatcher's voice was different from usual, tighter, faster. Ravencrest ER. This is incoming notification from Fort Alden coordinating. We have multiple critical inbound military trauma, ETA 6 minutes. Requesting your trauma bay cleared and your senior trauma physician on deck immediately. Sloane was already walking toward the bay, pulling on gloves, the kind of alert readiness he performed better than he actually felt it. All right, people, trauma protocol, Let's move. Emily moved with everyone else. She positioned herself at the edge of the bay because that was where she fit in the hierarchy Sloan had spent 8 months constructing, and she told herself it didn't matter, and mostly she believed it. The first vehicle came in at 7:58. It wasn't an ambulance, it was a military transport, a black Suburban with government plates that hadn't bothered stopping for normal procedures at the entrance. It pulled up to the ambulance bay, and 4 men climbed out, 2 of them supporting a third, who was barely on his feet and had blood soaking through a pressure dressing that covered most of his left side. The 4th man, tall, late 30s, tactical clothing with no visible insignia, face tight with the specific focus of someone managing multiple problems at once, came through the bay doors ahead of them all and swept the room once with his eyes. He found Emily before she moved an inch. She recognized his face at the same moment he recognized hers. There was a fraction of a second where something passed between them that had nothing to do with the room they were standing in and everything to do with a field hospital in a different part of the world years ago. Then it was over, and he was moving toward her, and she already knew what was happening before he said anything. "Major Carter." His voice was controlled but urgent, pitched low enough that only the people immediately around them caught it. He came within 2 feet of her and stopped. "We've got 3 critical and 2 walking wounded coming in behind this vehicle. I need you running this." She was already looking at the man they were holding up. Penetrating trauma, left chest, the dressing was soaked through and not slowing. "What happened?" "I'll brief you in 30 seconds. Are you running this?" From across the bay, Sloan's voice. "What's going on? Who authorized you to bypass admission, sir? I need you to direct your people to—" The man in tactical clothing turned and looked at Sloan for exactly 1 second. There was nothing threatening in it. It was quieter than threatening. "Step back." Sloan blinked. "Excuse me, this is my—" "I'm not asking twice." He turned back to Emily. "Are you running this?" Emily looked at the man with the chest wound. She looked at the bay. She looked at Sloan, who was already opening his mouth again, and she made a decision that had, in fact, been made a very long time ago. "I'm running this," she said. She stepped forward. "Get him on Bay 2, she said to the men holding the wounded operator. Her voice had changed in a way that some of the staff would notice later when they were describing it to people who hadn't been there. Something that had been held very carefully for a long time had simply stopped being held. "I need a chest tray, I need 2 large-bore IVs, and I need someone to call the OR and tell them to hold a room. Now." The staff moved. Not because of hospital hierarchy, because she sounded like someone who knew what happened when people didn't move. The second vehicle pulled up, then a third. The bay doors opened again, and the evening shift of Ravencrest Regional Medical Center's emergency department became something none of them had been trained for, and all of them would remember. In the controlled chaos of the next 4 minutes, as Emily moved between patients and called out assessment findings and directed resources with a precision that came from years of doing exactly this in conditions far worse than a well-lit hospital bay, no one laughed. No one made a comment about nursing degrees. Dr. Sloan stood at the edge of the room with his gloves still on and his face doing something complicated, watching a nurse he had tried to walk out of his department 30 minutes ago run a trauma response that none of his physicians were keeping up with. Paul Renfrew caught her eye for exactly a second as she passed the nursing station. His expression said, "I knew it." She didn't have time for that either. The man in tactical clothing fell into step beside her. "Third patient coming in has a TBI component. He was in and out on the ride over. Glasgow score? 8 when we loaded him. May have dropped. Neuro needs to be in this building in 20 minutes. Can you make that happen?" "Already called." "Good." She stopped at Bay 2 and assessed the chest wound patient in the way she'd assessed 100 like him. Hands and eyes both, reading the body the way you learn to when monitors aren't always available and your hands are the instrument. Tension pneumothorax building on the left. She didn't wait. She looked at Dr. Okafor, who had appeared at her elbow. Needle decompression, second intercostal space, midclavicular line left side. You're doing it. Okafor looked at the patient, looked at Emily, and nodded. "Okay. I'll talk you through it. Get the kit." From the doorway, Sloane's voice, different now, less certain, trying to find the right register. "Carter, I need to understand what is happening in my department." She didn't look at him. "Dr. Okafor is performing an indicated emergency procedure on a critical patient. I suggest you either assist or make room." She moved to the supply drawer. "Paul, where's the third patient?" "Bay 1, Glasgow 7. I need you there. Do not let anyone move him until I've seen his neck." "On it." The room was running now. Not smoothly. Nothing real ever runs smoothly. But it was running in the direction that kept people alive, which was the only direction Emily Carter had ever been interested in going. At the far end of the bay, a second military vehicle had arrived, and with it came 2 more men in tactical clothing, and behind them, something that made several of the civilian staff stop for a moment, even in the middle of everything. A uniformed officer, full dress, the kind of uniform that has enough hardware on it that you know, even if you don't know the specific ranks and ribbons, that this is someone whose arrival means something. He walked into the emergency department of Ravencrest Regional Medical Center and paused just inside the doors, taking in the room. His gaze moved across the bay and stopped when it found Emily. He walked toward her. She was mid-assessment, her hands on the third patient's cervical spine, and she felt him arrive at her peripheral vision and kept working. "Sir?" she said, without looking up. "Major Carter," he said. It was the second time in 20 minutes she'd heard that word, and the room, even in its controlled urgency, went slightly quieter around it. Several people heard it. Several people looked. Victor Sloan heard it. Emily finished her cervical assessment and straightened and met the officer's eyes, and something passed across her face that wasn't quite emotion and wasn't quite the absence of it. "General Marsh," she said. "We'll talk when you're done," he said simply. "Until then, this is your room." He stepped back. She turned back to her patients. Sloan was still standing at the edge of the bay, and in his face now was the beginning of an understanding that was going to take him several hours to fully process, but whose outlines were becoming visible in real time. He had spent the last several months systematically dismantling the career of someone he didn't know anything about, and the evidence of what he didn't know was currently filling his emergency department and calling her by a rank she had never once mentioned in 22 months of working beside him. The monitor on Bay 2 alarmed. Emily was already moving. The monitor on Bay 2 alarmed because the chest wound patient, a man named Reyes, she'd caught the name from one of his teammates, had dropped his oxygen saturation to 84 and was working too hard for every breath. The needle decompression had bought time, but not enough. Emily got to him in 4 steps and put her hands on his chest and felt what she needed to feel and made the decision in about 2 seconds. "He needs a chest tube," she said to Okafor. "Right side 2. Listen to his breath sounds." Okafor had her stethoscope on him before Emily finished the sentence. Her face changed. "You're right. Get the thoracostomy kit. Have you placed one before?" "Once, in residency." "Then you've placed one." Emily moved to the supply cabinet and was back in 20 seconds. "I'll walk you through it. His pressure is holding for now. We have a window, but it's not wide." Okafor's hands were steady, which was either training or adrenaline or both. She worked. Emily talked her through it in the flat, specific language of someone who had done this in worse lighting, with worse equipment and people shooting at the building, and she didn't say any of that because it wasn't relevant, just the steps, just what came next. The tube went in. Reyes's oxygen came up. His breathing evened out by increments. "Good," Emily said, and she meant it. "Watch his output. If the drainage goes above 200 in the first hour, call me before you do anything else." She moved. Bay 1 held a man named Kowalski, the TBI patient, and he was worse than the Glasgow score suggested, because Glasgow scores are blunt instruments, and the real picture was in the way his left pupil was lagging. She didn't need a neuroconsult to read that. She needed one to do anything about it. She looked up at Paul. "Where's neurosurgery?" 12 minutes out. Dr. Vance is driving in. Tell Dr. Vance I need her the moment she hits this floor, not when she's changed and briefed and had a coffee. The moment she hits this floor. Already texted her that." Emily looked at him. "Good." She checked Kowalski's pressure, adjusted the head positioning, and flagged the nurse beside her, a woman named Terry, who'd been at Ravencrest for 6 years and was one of the people who'd laughed earlier that evening. Terry wasn't laughing now.
She was tracking Emily's every move the way you track someone when you've realized you've been reading the room wrong for a long time and you're still catching up. Terry, elevate the head to 30 degrees, maintain neutral alignment. If his pressure systolic drops below 90, you get me immediately. You do not wait. You do not ask someone else. You come find me. Yes, Terry said. Not yes, Nurse Carter. Just yes, the way you answer someone in charge. The tactical team leader, she'd learned his name was Lieutenant Commander Rylan Bates, was waiting for her when she stepped out of Bay 1. He had a field notepad in his hand and dried blood on his jacket that wasn't his. She'd noticed earlier that he'd been moving between the bays the way a person does when they're responsible for all these men and have nothing to do but watch other people try to save them, which was its own particular kind of awful. Bates, she said, how's Kowalski? Serious. The neurosurgeon is 12 minutes out. He's stable for now. She didn't soften it or expand it. He didn't need either. Who else isn't telling me the full story? He understood immediately. Mercer, Bay 4. Walked in on his own, said his leg was fine. She turned toward Bay 4. How bad? Ballistic injury, right thigh. Entry and exit, but he packed it himself and hasn't let anyone look under the dressing. Of course he hasn't. She was already walking.
Mercer was sitting on the edge of the Bay 4 gurney with the expression of a man who had decided, without consulting anyone, that he was fine. He was around 30, square-jawed, and had the particular stubborn calm of someone who'd been trained to push through pain signals to the point where the signals no longer reliably reached the decision-making parts of his brain. Emily had treated a lot of men like this. She had, on at least 3 occasions she could remember clearly, had to talk one of them out of walking back into an active situation on a leg that had no business bearing weight. Mercer, she said, I'm okay. I didn't ask. She pulled on gloves. I'm going to look at the dressing. It's fine. The last person who told me their leg was fine in that tone of voice had nicked his femoral and was 20 minutes from exsanguination. She met his eyes. Let me look at the dressing, Mercer. He held her gaze for 3 seconds, then looked away. Fine. The dressing came off and she looked at the wound and kept her face neutral because Mercer didn't need her expression telling him things he already half knew. The wound itself was survivable. The trajectory had missed the major vessels and the packing had been effective. But the tissue damage was significant, and there was an early sign of something she didn't like around the wound margins. When did this happen? Approximately 4 hours ago? Did you clean it in the field? We were somewhat occupied. She didn't comment on that. I need a vascular consult to confirm no deep vessel involvement, and I need labs to rule out early compartment syndrome. She looked up at him. You're going to be okay. But you were 45 minutes from this being a different conversation. He processed this. How bad's Kowalski? Serious. Reyes? We're managing. He nodded once and looked at the ceiling. Something moved across his face that wasn't quite fear and wasn't quite grief. The specific expression of people who live in proximity to loss and have learned not to let it land until later. Kowalski's got a kid, he said. 6 months old. She was writing the consult order. She stopped writing for exactly 1 second. Then she kept writing. Then we make sure he goes home, she said. It wasn't a promise. She knew better than to make promises about things she couldn't control. But she said it like it was something worth fighting for, because it was, and he needed to hear it from someone who sounded like they meant it. She went back out into the bay. Victor Sloan was at the nursing station. She'd been tracking his location in her peripheral vision the way she tracked all non-essential elements in a working trauma environment, not focusing on it, just maintaining awareness. He'd moved twice in the last 30 minutes, once to the edge of Bay 2 where he'd watched Okafor place the chest tube without intervening, and once to the phone at the nursing station where he'd made what looked like a short, tense call. He was still there now, and when she came out of Bay 4, he straightened and stepped toward her. Carter, I need a word. In about 20 minutes. Now. She stopped. She looked at him. Something in her face must have communicated what she would and would not be doing with the next 20 minutes of her life, because he stopped moving toward her. These are military patients, he said, shifting tack. There are liability implications. The hospital has a chain of command, and I am the head of this department, and what's happening in these bays right now is not what? General Marsh's voice came from 6 feet behind Sloan. Sloan turned. Marsh was standing with his hands behind his back and his expression set to a particular kind of neutral that senior officers perfect because it's more effective than anger. I was explaining, Sloan started, that there are protocols. Major Carter is the most qualified trauma specialist in this building, Marsh said. She trained combat medics who are currently deployed in 3 theaters. She developed triage protocols that are still in use at Fort Alden and 2 other installations. She left active duty 26 months ago for personal reasons, and when she did, she took a job in your emergency department, and I gather from the situation I walked into this evening that this building has spent 2 years treating her like she's the least important person in it. Sloan's mouth opened. Don't, Marsh said. It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. Not right now. Sloan closed his mouth. Marsh looked at Emily. When you're done, Major. She nodded and went back to her patients. The next hour and 40 minutes were the kind of controlled emergency that people who work in trauma settings dream about being equal to. And most of them are. Until they're actually in it, and the systems and the training and the sheer cognitive load of tracking 5 critical patients simultaneously gets tested against the reality of limited resources and a staff that had never worked together in this configuration before. Doctor. Vance arrived at the 11-minute mark. She'd driven faster than projected, and Emily gave her the Kowalski briefing in 90 seconds at the bay door, sharp and specific, because Vance was good and didn't need to be managed, just brought up to speed. Vance went in, did her own assessment, came out 2 minutes later and said, I need him in a OR. How's his pressure? Holding. You've got a window. I'm calling it now. Good. Reyes was stable but needed monitoring. Mercer's vascular consult had been pulled in. A surgeon named Dr. Alicia Drummond, who had the efficient manner of someone who had been called in after hours before and had made her peace with it. She confirmed no major vessel involvement and agreed with Emily's compartment syndrome concern. They worked out a monitoring protocol. Drummond, on her way out of the bay, paused and looked at Emily. Army? She said. Major, Emily said. Combat nurse and trauma instructor. Fort Alden. Then 2 deployments. Drummond nodded slowly. You want to tell me how a combat nurse and trauma instructor ends up in a floor position at Ravencrest Regional? Emily looked at her. 2 years ago, I wanted something quieter. Drummond's expression shifted slightly. Did you get it? Emily didn't answer. She moved on to the next patient. The 5th operator, a man she'd identified as Sergeant Diaz, had presented as one of the walking wounded, but had been sitting very still in the waiting area for 40 minutes, and stillness, in Emily's experience, was not the same as fine. She found him herself when the initial wave had stabilized, pulled a chair across from him, sat down. Because sitting down with a patient changes the dynamic entirely, it says, I'm not going anywhere, and said, Diaz, talk to me. He looked at her. I'm not critical. I didn't say you were. She waited. He was quiet for a moment. Blunt force. Took a hit during extraction, left side. I've had bruised ribs before. Where does it hurt when you breathe? He showed her. She pressed gently in 3 places and watched his face, and when she pressed the 3rd one, he breathed very carefully and didn't move. She got him into a bay and ordered imaging. 2 cracked ribs and a small pneumothorax that wouldn't need intervention but needed watching. He would have sat in that chair all night and told himself he was fine. Why didn't you say something? She asked when she had the films up. He looked at the images of his own chest on the screen. There were guys worse off. There usually are, she said. You still have to tell someone. She set him up with monitoring and a respiratory check protocol. On her way out, she stopped and said, without turning around, You did the right thing, telling your guys where you were going tonight, even if it took you a minute. She didn't hear what he said back, if anything. She was already moving. At 9:47 p.m., Kowalski came out of emergency neurosurgery with a favorable outcome. The bleed had been caught early enough, Vance had done clean work, and the post-op report said he was stable and expected to regain full function. Bates was in the hallway when Vance delivered the news,
and he received it in the way men in his position receive good news in the field, without visible relief, just a slight change in the quality of his stillness, and a single slow exhale. "Good," he said. Emily, standing nearby, watched him and thought about the 6-month-old.
Paul Renfrew found her in the supply room a few minutes later, which had become their unofficial debrief location. He was holding 2 cups of coffee, and he handed her one without asking if she wanted it. She took it. "Kowalski's going to make it," he said. "I heard. Everyone in this department heard." He leaned against the wall. "Emily, what Sloan did tonight, don't. I'm going to anyway." He looked at his coffee. "He had security ready to walk you out. After everything you did for Whitmore, for Mia, he had them ready to walk you out like you stole something." She drank the coffee. It was bad hospital coffee, which was also what she'd been drinking for 22 months and was therefore familiar. "He's not the first person who read me wrong," she said. "He's the first one who did it this publicly and then got this dramatically corrected." Paul paused. "There are going to be consequences for him." "That's not my department. Emily." "Paul." She looked at him. "I have 4 operators to monitor, a vascular follow-up to check in 20 minutes, and a debrief with General Marsh that I'm already late for. The thing with Sloan, that's going to happen the way it's going to happen. I've got work to do." He was quiet for a moment. "You know what's strange?" he said. "You're exactly the same person you were this morning. Nothing about you is different." She thought about that. "Yeah," she said. "I know." She put the coffee down and went to find General Marsh. He was in the small conference room adjacent to the nursing station, the room where Constance Park had, less than 12 hours ago, offered Emily a float pool position as if it were a gift. Marsh was standing at the window with his hands behind his back, looking out at the ambulance bay, where 2 military vehicles were still parked and 3 uniformed personnel were maintaining a quiet perimeter. Emily came in and closed the door and remained standing because that was the posture this conversation called for. "All 5 are going to make it," she said. "Kowalski's the most serious. He'll need follow-up neurology, but Vance did good work." "I know." He turned from the window. "I already called his wife." She nodded. "I need to ask you something," he said. "And I need you to answer it straight. Always. When you left Fort Alden, when you put in your papers, was it because of what happened at Kaost, or was it something else?" The question landed the way old questions do when you haven't answered them out loud in a long time. She kept her face steady. "What happened at Kaost is part of it," she said. "The part I can say is that after 3 years of teaching other people how to survive, I needed to be somewhere I wasn't responsible for whether anyone lived through a deployment. I needed—" She paused, chose the word carefully. "Smaller." Marsh looked at her. "Did smaller work out?" She thought about the last 22 months. She thought about Whitmore and Mia and the float pool reassignment and Sloan's voice saying, "I'd like security to walk you out." "It had some problems," she said. He almost smiled. "The situation here tonight isn't going to stay quiet," he said. "You know that." "I figured." The hospital's administration has already had 2 calls, one from Fort Alden's JAG office and one from a federal oversight contact that I'm not going to name right now. What happened in this department with Sloan, with you, it's going to open some doors that people here have been keeping shut. She was quiet for a moment. "How much do they know?" "Enough to start asking questions." His voice was measured. "There are other nurses in this department who filed complaints, not just about scope, about documentation changes, orders that appeared in charts that weren't placed by the physicians whose names were on them." Emily stared at him. "Did you know?" he asked. "I suspected," she said slowly. "I documented what I could document. I flagged it through the appropriate channels, and the appropriate channels didn't move." She paused. "Who sent JAG?" "Someone who received a copy of your personnel file," Marsh said, "and noticed that the formal complaint filed against you directly preceded a series of chart alterations on 2 of the patients you'd flagged concerns about." She went very still. "Whitmore," she said, "and Mia." Marsh nodded. "The original documentation doesn't match the current file entries." Emily's hands were steady. Her voice was steady, but somewhere behind her eyes something was doing a slow, quiet calculation, because she knew exactly what that meant. She had documented everything. She always documented everything. And if the files had been changed, if someone had gone into those records and altered what was written, then the copies she'd made for herself weren't backup anymore. They were evidence. "I need to make a phone call," she said. "I thought you might," Marsh said. He stepped away from the window. "I'll give you the room." He went out, and she stood alone in the conference room where she'd been demoted that morning. In the hospital, she'd been walked out of that evening, and she pulled out her phone and opened a folder she'd kept locked under a name that meant nothing to anyone who didn't know what they were looking at. 47 documents, dated entries, time-stamped copies of original chart notes, photographs of physical paperwork taken before they could be altered. 2 years of quiet, careful, methodical documentation from a woman who had learned, in places that made this look like a practice run, that the truth only protects you if you can prove it. She found the number she was looking for. It rang twice. The voice on the other end was alert despite the hour, which told her the call had been expected. "This is Special Agent Carla Donovan, Office of the Inspector General." Emily sat down for the first time in 3 hours. "Agent Donovan," she said, "my name is Emily Carter. I'm a nurse at Ravencrest Regional Medical Center in Stone Harbor. And I have documentation of falsified medical records, retaliatory personnel actions, and potentially criminal alterations to patient charts. I've been sitting on this for 2 months waiting for the right moment." She paused. "I think the moment just arrived." There was a brief silence on the other end, then, "Ms. Carter, I've been briefed on your situation as of about 40 minutes ago. We have investigators available to be on site within the hour if you're ready to receive them." Emily looked through the glass wall of the conference room at the emergency department. Her emergency department, she thought, with the particular tired clarity of someone who had stopped pretending otherwise. Paul was at the nursing station. Terry was checking on Diaz. Dr. Okafor was writing up her chart notes with the focused expression of someone who had done something real tonight and knew it. At the far end of the bay, Victor Sloan was on his phone again. His back was to the room. His posture, for the first time since she'd known him, was uncertain around the edges. "Send them," Emily said. She hung up and sat for another 20 seconds in the quiet, letting herself feel the weight of what she'd just set in motion, because she was human enough to need that moment, even if she was disciplined enough to keep it short. Then she stood up, smoothed her scrubs, and walked back out into the department. She had patients to check on. She was halfway across the bay when the main entrance doors opened again, and this time it wasn't military personnel, and it wasn't medevac, and it wasn't anything she'd been anticipating, because the 2 people who walked through the doors were in civilian clothes with federal credentials already held out at the security desk, and behind them were 2 uniformed Stone Harbor police officers. And the look on the face of the senior federal agent as he scanned the room told her that whoever had briefed him, they had told him what to look for. He found Sloan in about 4 seconds. Emily watched from the center of the bay as the agent walked across the emergency department of Ravencrest Regional Medical Center with the unhurried certainty of someone who has done this before, who knows what the next several hours look like, and who is very clear on how they end. Sloan turned around. The agent said something Emily couldn't hear from across the room. What she could see was Victor Sloan's face in the moment he understood that the carefully maintained structure of 8 years, the hierarchy, the loyalty of the people he'd cultivated, the complaints he'd filed and the records he'd altered and the careers he'd quietly broken, had just become a liability instead of a shield. And that the nurse he'd tried to walk out of his department 4 hours ago was standing in the middle of the room watching it happen. Sloan didn't say anything at first. That was the thing Emily noticed from across the bay. Not panic, not bluster, just a man standing very still while his brain did rapid calculations about how bad this was. She'd seen that look before, in different contexts, on different people, and it always meant the same thing. They already knew what they'd done, and they were trying to figure out how much anyone else knew. The senior agent, she could read his credentials from 20 feet now, OIG badge, federal issue, was speaking quietly, and Sloan was listening with his arms slightly away from his body in the unconscious posture of someone who has just realized they're being managed. One of the Stone Harbor officers had positioned himself near the nursing station exit without making it obvious that was what he was doing. The second federal agent had gone directly to the nursing station itself and was speaking to the charge desk admin, who looked alarmed. Paul appeared at Emily's elbow. "Is that what I think it is?" "Federal investigators," she said. OIG. He exhaled slowly. "Emily, how long have you been—" "2 months." He looked at her. "You were building a case for 2 months while he was filing complaints against you." "I was documenting irregularities," she said. "The case is their job." She watched the agent hand Sloan a card and say something that made Sloan's jaw go tight. Then the agent turned away from Sloan, not dismissively, just done with that part, and scanned the room until he found Emily. He walked toward her with the direct, unhurried stride of someone who knows where they're going and isn't performing it. "Ms. Carter," he said, "I'm Senior Investigator Dale Forsyth, OIG. Agent Donovan briefed me on your call. I understand the timing tonight is—" He glanced at the trauma bays, at the military personnel still visible through the bay windows. "Complicated. The medical situation is managed," she said. "All patients are stable or post-surgical and being monitored." "Good. I'm going to need access to the department's record system, and I'll need to speak with you at length, but I want to do that in a way that doesn't disrupt patient care. Give me 30 minutes to hand off monitoring responsibilities to my team. Then I'm yours." He nodded and stepped back, and she turned to Paul and said, "I need you to take primary on Reyes and Diaz for the next hour. Reyes, watch his chest tube output. If drainage hits 200, call Drummond. Diaz needs a respiratory check every 30, and if his SAT drops below 95, I want imaging. Can you do that?" "Yes," Paul said. No hesitation. She went through the bays methodically. Okafor was managing well. She'd stepped into the gap tonight in a way that she'd be processing for a while, and Emily stopped long enough to tell her so in plain language, because the woman had performed an emergency procedure on a trauma patient under pressure for the first time tonight and deserved to hear a direct word about it. Okafor received it awkwardly, the way people do when they're not used to acknowledgement coming without conditions attached. Terry was with Kowalski's post-op monitoring. Emily checked the chart, checked the numbers, and said, "You're doing fine. If anything changes, don't wait." Terry looked at her and started to say something and stopped. Then she said, "I heard what he said to you this afternoon in the hallway about security walking you out." Emily waited. "I didn't say anything, and I should have." Terry wasn't looking for absolution. She was just stating a fact that was sitting badly with her. "I'm sorry." "Do your job tonight," Emily said. "That's enough." She went to find General Marsh and Lieutenant Commander Bates and told them both what was happening in terms clear enough that neither man would be surprised later. Marsh received it without visible reaction. Bates looked at the federal agent setting up at the nursing station and then back at Emily. "You had all this ready before tonight," he said. It wasn't quite a question. "I document everything," she said. "Old habit. From the Army. From watching what happens when people don't." He was quiet for a moment. "Reyes wants to know if you're the same Major Carter who ran the Coast protocols in 2019. She felt the name the way you feel a scar when someone touches it. Present, dull, familiar. Tell him to rest." "He said to tell you the guys from the 75th still talk about what you did out there." She looked at Bates and didn't say anything, and he read it correctly and nodded and dropped it. The conference room had been converted, by the time she got there, into something that looked like the beginning of a serious investigation. Forsyth had a laptop open and 2 tablets out, and a colleague, a younger agent named Pratt, who moved with the focused efficiency of someone trying to prove something, was already pulling files from the hospital records system with access codes that had apparently been authorized from above. Emily sat down and opened her phone and sent Forsyth the folder she'd been maintaining for 2 months. 47 documents, locked, time-stamped, each one annotated with clinical context she'd written at the time, specifically so that someone who wasn't a nurse could understand what they were reading. Forsyth went quiet when the files came through. He scrolled for almost a minute without speaking. "These chart alterations," he said, "the Whitmore file and the pediatric case, Miyasato. The original notes you preserved, how did you get copies?" "I printed them at the time of documentation," she said. "In both cases, I had a clinical concern significant enough that I wanted a contemporaneous record that couldn't be altered after the fact." I photographed the printouts. The metadata on the photos shows the timestamp. Forsyth looked at Pratt. Pratt was already nodding. Timestamps check out, he said, and the current chart entries for both patients are materially different from what she preserved. Someone modified them after the fact. Can you trace who made the modifications? Emily asked. We'll get the access logs, Forsyth said. Hospital EMR systems retain them. He paused. Ms. Carter, I want to be direct with you. What you've given us is significant, but Sloan is going to have representation within the hour, and they're going to move to contain this. The next 12 hours are going to determine how far this investigation goes and how fast. I need you to walk me through every incident in this file, in detail, tonight. I understand, she said. It was 10:23 p.m. What followed was 2 hours of the most precise, exhausting thing she'd done all night, which was saying something given what the night had already been. Forsyth was good. He asked questions that cut to the relevant point without meandering. He didn't editorialize, and he didn't try to put words in her mouth, which she appreciated because she dealt with people who did that, and it always created problems downstream. She walked him through the Whitmore case, the Mia Sato case, 3 other incidents she'd documented that were less dramatic but equally revealing of a pattern, and the formal complaint Sloan had filed against her, which she characterized accurately as retaliation and supported with a timeline that made the retaliation obvious. She was clinically precise. She did not editorialize. She used the same language she'd used to write the documentation, which was specific and free of emotion because that was how documentation that holds up works. At 11:15, her monitoring phone buzzed. Paul. She looked at the screen, Rhea's drainage at 185, watching closely. Everything else stable. She texted back, "Keep me updated. Good work tonight." At 11:40, Forsyth closed his laptop and looked at her. "I want to tell you something, and I want you to hear it clearly," he said. "What you've given us, combined with what came through military channels tonight, is enough to open a full criminal investigation. Not just administrative, criminal." He let that sit for a moment. The chart alterations alone constitute patient record fraud under federal statute. The retaliation case is going to build on top of that. And there's something else we've identified in the past 2 hours that you may not be aware of. She waited. 2 of the nurses who previously filed complaints through Ravencrest's internal system, complaints that were subsequently dismissed or buried, those nurses were also transitioned to float pool positions, or non-renewed within months of filing. Their personnel files show the same formal complaint structure Sloan used against you. Forsyth's voice was even. This isn't the first time he's done this. You're just the first one who kept records good enough to prove it. She was quiet for a moment. She thought about the 2 other nurses. She didn't know who they were, but she could construct a general picture of what the last year had looked like for them, and it wasn't a comfortable picture. "What happens to them?" she asked. "That's part of what gets unwound," he said. She nodded and stood up, because sitting still when her brain was running this hot was harder than moving. She went to the window. Outside, the parking lot was quieter now. 1 military vehicle remained. The others had been released. The hospital was doing what hospitals always do after the emergency breaks, which is slowly restabilize around its routines, the monitors and the quiet footsteps and the shift change paperwork, the world going back to its usual tempo even though something fundamental had changed. "Ms. Carter," Forsyth said. She turned. The hospital's chief of medicine was reached an hour ago, Dr. Graham Aldis. He's been informed that a federal investigation has been opened and that he should consult with the hospital's legal team before taking any personnel actions tonight. Forsyth paused. That instruction is specifically intended to prevent anyone from terminating you as a preemptive move. She hadn't thought of that. She should have. Has anyone tried? There was a call to HR at 10:45 p.m. from Sloan's extension, Pratt said, without looking up from his tablet. We were already monitoring the internal lines with authorization. The HR director did not take action. She thought about that. Sloan at 10:45, the investigation already unfolding around him, still trying to consolidate control through the mechanisms that had always worked before. It was almost understandable, the way a reflex was understandable, just not useful anymore. "I need to check on my patients," she said. Forsyth nodded. I know where to find you. The department had shifted into the quieter late-night rhythm by the time she came back out. The military operators who were ambulatory were settled, the post-surgical monitoring was steady, and the staff who remained on shift were moving with a subdued focus that told her the adrenaline had metabolized and the processing had begun. She did her rounds methodically. Reyes first. His drainage had leveled off at 192 and wasn't climbing, which was acceptable. His color was better, and he was awake and watching her with the same assessing expression she recognized from every operator she'd ever treated, measuring whether she'd tell him the truth. "You're going to need the chest tube for another 48 hours minimum," she said. "After that, assuming no complications, we're talking about a real recovery." Define real. 6 to 8 weeks before you're operational. Don't push it to 4. He looked at the ceiling. "Kowalski? Stable post-op. Good prognosis. His wife coming?" "I would assume so." She adjusted his monitoring leads. "You were in good hands tonight." "We were in your hands tonight," he said. "There's a difference." She didn't respond to that. She moved on to Diaz, whose pneumothorax was behaving as expected. Not worsening, slowly improving, the kind of outcome that looked like nothing happened when, in fact, it was the result of catching something early enough that nothing dramatic needed to. He was asleep. She checked his chart and moved on. She was at the nursing station writing up her shift notes when she heard the sound from the main corridor Saz, the kind of sound that doesn't belong in a hospital at midnight, which is why it registered immediately. Not loud, not violent, just distinctly wrong. A voice raised, a door, movement that had urgency in it. She got up. The main corridor outside the ER connected to the administrative wing, and that was where it was coming from. She followed the sound and found, outside the administrative suite, a situation that had the quality of something that had just gone sideways fast. Dr. Victor Sloan was in the hallway. He had a folder of papers in his hand, and he was talking to a woman Emily identified after a moment as Janet Keller, Ravencrest Hospital administrator, a careful, political, expensive suit kind of executive who had spent 12 years keeping the hospital out of trouble by being very good at making trouble look like something else. Keller's face was doing something uncomfortable. Behind her, through the glass of the administrator's office, Emily could see 2 members of the hospital's legal team, phones in hand. Sloan saw Emily at the same moment she saw him. Something shifted in the hallway. "Carter," he said. His voice had lost the confident register of the past 2 years and found something rawer underneath it. "You want to tell me how long you've been building whatever you gave those investigators tonight?" She stopped. She assessed the hallway the way she assessed a room. Keller wasn't going to intervene. The legal team wasn't going to come out of that office. This was Sloan and her and a corridor, and he had a folder in his hand and she had nothing, and somewhere a federal investigator was 30 seconds away if she needed him. She didn't need him. "I documented what I observed," she said. "The same thing I was trained to do. The same thing every nurse in your department was trained to do. You were building a case against me while working in my department. I was building a record," she said. "There's a difference. A case is their job." She looked at him directly. "Dr. Sloan, I have attorneys I could contact. I chose not to because I don't want a settlement and I don't want a payout. I want the patients in this hospital to have accurate charts and the staff in this department to be able to report a clinical concern without ending up in the float pool. That's what I want." His jaw worked. "You have no idea what running this department actually involves." "I have a pretty good idea of what it shouldn't involve," she said. Keller made a small sound that wasn't quite a word. Sloan looked at her, then he looked at his folder. Some of the forward momentum went out of him, the way it does when a person has run the scenario in their head and arrived at the end of it before it's over and found out they don't like what's there. "The military patients are going to generate attention," he said, and now his voice had changed again, quieter, more calculated. "General Marsh, federal investigators showing up here tonight. This is going to be in the press. The hospital is going to want this managed." "Then the hospital should have managed it 8 months ago," Emily said, when the first complaint about record alterations came through. From behind her, "Ms. Carter," Forsyth's voice. She turned. He was at the end of the corridor with Pratt, and Pratt had something in his hand that looked like a printed document. Forsyth looked at Sloan with the expression of someone making a decision. Dr. Sloan, I need to ask you to return to the conference room. We have some additional questions, and I need to advise you that you may want your legal representation present before we continue. He paused. Your attorney has been notified and is on his way. Sloan looked from Forsyth to Emily and back. Now, please, Forsyth said. Sloan went. Forsyth stopped beside Emily. You should go back to your department, he said. We have what we need for tonight. The rest of this is going to take weeks. He said it the way people say things that are meant to be reassuring, but also mean this isn't over by a long distance. She went back to the ER. At 1:15 a.m., General Marsh found her at the medication cart. He was wearing his coat now, which meant he was leaving. She put down the chart she was reviewing and turned to face him. I'm heading back to Fort Alden, he said. I'll have someone coordinate with you on the operator follow-up. Vance will be looped in on Kowalski's recovery. Understood. He was quiet for a moment. The incident at Chaos, he said. I know you've never wanted to talk about it. I'm not going to make you, but I want you to know it's in the record correctly, what happened out there and what you did. It's documented. Not the version that was easier to write. She looked at him. I made sure of that before you left active duty, he said. I should have told you. She hadn't known that. She stayed quiet for a moment and let it settle because it was the kind of thing that takes a moment to fit into the picture you've been carrying. Thank you, she said, and she meant it without condition. He nodded once. Get some sleep when this shift ends, he said. Major. He left. She stood at the medication cart and breathed for a few seconds and then picked her chart back up. At 2:08 a.m., the department had reached something close to calm. The last military transport had departed. The investigators were still in the conference room, but they were quiet and contained. Most of the staff had moved through whatever they were going to feel tonight and arrived at the exhausted functional state that gets work done in the small hours. She was finishing a set of notes when Pratt came through the ER doors, moving faster than he had been. He went directly to Forsyth's location and said something low and urgent, and Forsyth's head came up immediately. Then Forsyth moved, not running, but the version of fast walking that precedes running, toward the administrative wing. Emily watched through the nursing station glass. Paul came to stand beside her. What is that? I don't know, she said. 2 minutes later, Dr. Graham Aldis, Ravencrest's chief of medicine, a man she'd spoken to exactly once in 22 months at an all-staff orientation, came through the main entrance in a coat thrown over what looked like clothes he'd already been sleeping in. He was on his phone. His face was the specific color of someone who has received catastrophic news and is still in the stage where they can't quite believe it's real. Forsyth intercepted him in the main corridor. Emily couldn't hear the conversation. She could see Aldis's face while it was happening. She watched the expression go through several stages in quick succession. Shock, then denial, then the particular grayness of someone who has realized they are in a problem that is much larger than they understood an hour ago. Paul said very quietly, Emily, what exactly did you put in that folder? She watched Aldis put both hands on the wall for a moment, steadying himself. Documentation, she said. What I observed. What I could prove. Forsyth said something else, and Aldis straightened and nodded, and they went together toward the administrative wing. The ER was quiet around them. The monitors beeped their steady rhythms. Somewhere down the hall, Reyes was asleep and Diaz was breathing easier, and Kowalski was post-surgical and stable with a 6-month-old daughter at home who would have her father back. Paul said nothing for a full minute. Then, this is going to change this place. Yeah, Emily said. Is that what you wanted? She considered that honestly. I wanted accurate charts and a department where a nurse can flag a clinical concern without losing their job, she said. Whether that changes this place is up to this place. She picked up the next chart. Her phone buzzed on the counter. She glanced at it, an unknown number with a Stone Harbor area code. She let it go to voicemail and kept working. 30 seconds later, the voicemail notification came through. She played it with the volume low. The voice was female, slightly breathless, and it took her a moment to place it. Constance Park, the nursing director. The woman who had sat across a desk from her that afternoon and offered her a float pool position and called it flexibility. Ms. Carter, this is Constance Park. A pause. I've been on the phone with hospital legal for the past hour. I've also been given access to certain materials that were presented to the OIG this evening. I need you to know that I did not have full knowledge of the extent of what was in Dr. Sloan's complaint file. I was given a summary. What I've seen tonight is not what I was told I was acting on. Another pause. I don't know if this matters at this point, but I wanted you to hear it. The voicemail ended. Emily stared at her phone for a moment. She thought about whether it mattered. She thought about 47 documents and 2 years of careful silence and a float pool position offered like a consolation prize. She thought about Constance Park sitting in her office, reading tonight's materials, and having to decide what kind of person she was going to be in the aftermath. She put her phone away. At 3:30 a.m., Forsyth came back through the ER with his coat on and his bag over his shoulder. He stopped at the nursing station. "We're wrapping up for tonight," he said. "The investigation is formally opened. We'll be back tomorrow with additional staff." He looked at her steadily. "I need to tell you something before I go." She set down the chart. "What we found in the EMR access logs tonight," he said, "goes further than the 2 patient files you documented. Our preliminary pull shows 11 chart modifications over the past 14 months. Not all of them are Sloan's access code." He paused.
3 of them are Aldis's. The department went very still around her, though nothing actually changed. The monitors kept beeping. Paul kept moving at the far end of the bay. The world kept running at its ordinary pace. It was just inside her head that everything stopped and reconfigured. "Aldis knew," she said. "The access logs suggest he made direct modifications on at least 3 patient files. We don't have intent established yet, but the logs don't lie." Forsyth picked up his bag. "Go home after your shift, get some sleep, and don't discuss this with anyone in the hospital until we've spoken again." He left. She stood at the nursing station and let herself process what that meant. Not just for Sloan, but for the layers above Sloan, the people who'd had the power to stop this years ago and had chosen not to. She thought about the nurses who'd been floated out before her, the complaints that had been buried, the patients whose charts told stories now that didn't match what had actually happened to them. Her shift technically ended at 11 p.m. She had been here for more than 8 hours past that. She was tired in the specific way that goes bone deep, past the point where coffee helps. She went to check on Reyes one more time. He was awake. He looked at her when she came in. She checked his tube output, down to 60, which was where she wanted it, and reviewed his vitals and made a note in the chart. "Major Carter," he said. She didn't correct him on the title. "Reyes. Bates told me what happened tonight, with the hospital." He was watching her face. "He said you've been working here for 2 years with nobody knowing." "People knew what they needed to know," she said. "He said they tried to fire you 3 hours before we showed up." She wrote a note in the chart. "Get some sleep. You saved my life tonight." She stopped writing. She looked at him. He was serious and unperforming, and she received it the way she'd learned to receive things like this. Not deflecting, not making it small, but not letting it fill more space than it should either. "I did my job," she said. "You're going to be fine." She put the chart down and turned toward the door. "Major." His voice stopped her. "Whatever they did to you in this place, you're still the same person who built those Coast protocols. That doesn't go away because some administrator decided you were invisible." She stood in the doorway for a moment. "I know," she said. She walked out. The hallway was empty. At the far end of the administrative corridor, the lights in the conference room were still on. Through the glass, she could see 2 of the hospital's legal team with their documents spread across the table, and sitting across from them, in the specific posture of a man who has used up all his moves, was Victor Sloan. And behind him, visible through the inner glass door, just arriving, Graham Aldis, chief of medicine, taking a seat beside his attorney. 2 of them. Emily stood in the empty hallway and looked at both of them through the glass, and neither man saw her there, and she turned and walked back toward the ER because there was still a shift to finish and patients who needed her. She was 3 steps down the hallway when her phone buzzed again. She pulled it out expecting Paul or Forsyth or the hospital's now panicking legal team. The number on the screen was a Washington, D.C. area code she didn't recognize. She answered.
The voice was male, controlled, and introduced itself in a way that made her stop walking entirely. Not military, not OIG. The name it gave was attached to an office she hadn't thought about in 26 months, and the words that came after it were not words she had anticipated hearing in the hallway of Ravencrest Regional Medical Center at 3:47 in the morning. "Major Carter," the voice said, "we need to speak with you about Dr. Victor Sloan, specifically about contracts he held prior to his position at Ravencrest, and the patients in those facilities who we now believe may have been harmed." She stood in the hallway with the phone against her ear and the overhead fluorescents humming above her and let the man finish speaking before she said anything. His name was Warren Holt. He worked for the Department of Health and Human Services Office of Counsel, which was different from OIG in ways that mattered. OIG investigated fraud after the fact. HHS Counsel got involved when the fraud had federal contract implications and the money trail led somewhere with a government stamp on it. He had a careful, precise way of speaking that told her he'd done this before and knew exactly how much to say on an unsecured line at 4 in the morning. Dr. Sloan held consulting contracts with 3 federally funded rural health facilities between 2014 and 2019, Holt said, before Ravencrest. "We've been building a case on those contracts for 14 months. What happened tonight at your hospital? The OIG investigation. That's the first jurisdictional overlap we've had that gives us grounds to consolidate." He paused. "Your documentation is relevant to our case, not peripheral, central." "What did he do?" she asked. "At the federal facilities, the pattern matches what you documented at Ravencrest. Modified records, suppressed adverse event reports, retaliation against staff who raised concerns. But at those facilities, 3 patients died in circumstances that are now under review." His voice stayed even. "We believe the chart alterations were designed to conceal causation." She pressed her back against the hallway wall. 3 patients. Not complications that happened despite good care. Patients who might have survived if someone hadn't changed what the record said. "Why are you calling me at 4 a.m.?" she said. "Because Sloan's attorney contacted our office 2 hours ago. He's offering cooperation on the federal contracts case in exchange for a reduced charge agreement on the Ravencrest fraud." A beat. "Which means he's going to try to make this about the smallest version of what he did. Administrative errors, clerical mistakes, poor documentation practices. His attorney is good, and they move fast. The only thing that closes that door is having the Ravencrest evidence be airtight before they file the cooperation agreement in the morning. Forsyth has everything I documented. Forsyth has your file. I need to understand its scope. Specifically, did you document anything about personnel decisions? Not just chart alterations, about who knew what and when." She thought about Constance Park's voicemail. She thought about the access logs Forsyth had shown her, Aldis's code on 3 modified charts. She thought about 8 months of watching the internal complaint system eat itself. "Yes," she said. "I need to speak with you in person. I can be in Stone Harbor by 7 a.m. I'm working a shift that ends—" She stopped. Her shift had ended 4 hours ago. She was still here because there was work, and because she didn't know what going home looked like right now. "I'll be here," she said. She hung up and stood in the hallway and breathed. Then she went back to work. Paul found her at 4:30 a.m. trying to eat a granola bar that had come from the bottom of her bag and tasted like it. He leaned against the counter beside her and didn't say anything for a moment, which she appreciated. "Reyes is asking when he can have real food," he said finally. "Clear liquids until Dr. Drummond clears him tomorrow. He knows this. He's negotiating. He said to tell you the Navy is very unhappy with clear liquids. The Navy can adapt." She finished the granola bar. "How are you doing?" He looked mildly startled, the way people do when the person who's been handling a crisis all night turns around and asks them a direct question. Yeah, I'm okay." He thought about it. "It's a lot to process." "It is." "That phone call earlier, the one you took in the hallway." She looked at him. "Paul, I'm not asking what it was. I'm asking if you're all right." She considered the question honestly, which was harder than it sounded at 4:30 in the morning after the longest shift of her recent life. "I'm tired," she said, "and I'm angry.
which I've been managing for 2 years, and tonight it's a little closer to the surface than usual, but I'm all right." He nodded. 3 patients, he said quietly. "At those other places." She went still. "Who told you that?" "Forsyth told me when he was leaving. I think he told me because he wanted someone in this department to know the full size of it." Paul's voice was careful. "Emily, you've been carrying this for 2 years alone." "I carried what I could prove," she said. "The rest wasn't mine to carry until I had something to hand it to." "That's not a human way to live." She looked at him. "No," she said, "it's not." She picked up the next chart and they worked beside each other without speaking for a while, which was its own kind of honesty. At 6:15 a.m., the day shift began to arrive. The department recalibrated around the new bodies, nurses checking their assignments, residents getting handoffs, the ordinary machinery of a hospital morning pretending that the previous 12 hours hadn't happened. Except they kept glancing at the conference room, where the lights were still on and 2 legal team members were still visible. And they kept glancing at the military personnel badge still clipped to the security desk log. And they kept glancing at Emily. Not the way they had looked at her yesterday, not that look. The shift change briefing happened at 6:30. Emily gave her handoffs methodically. Each patient, each clinical status, each monitoring parameter and anticipated decision point. The day shift nurses listened the way you listen when you've heard overnight gossip and you're reconciling it with the actual person in front of you. She didn't address it, and they didn't ask, and the handoffs were clean. Warren Holt arrived at 7:02 a.m. with a colleague named Marcus Webb and no luggage, which meant he'd either come straight from wherever he'd been or he'd been closer than D.C. when he called. He was 50s, gray suit, the kind of face that gave nothing away without being unkind about it. Webb was younger, had a tablet in his hand, and the focused attention of someone whose job was to capture everything. Forsyth was already back. He and Holt greeted each other with the slightly territorial courtesy of federal agencies that technically cooperate and practically compete, and Emily sat in the conference room between them and drank the first decent coffee of the morning. Paul had procured it from somewhere, bless him, and went through it again. The second time through her documentation was different from the first. With Forsyth, she'd been establishing the Ravencrest case, what Sloan had done here, to these patients, to these staff members. With Holt, the frame expanded. He pulled up the federal contract records on his own laptop and cross-referenced dates, and 3 times he stopped her mid-explanation and asked her to repeat something while Webb typed. At the 40-minute mark, Holt looked up. "The formal complaint Sloan filed against you," he said. "Dated? 8 months ago. That's 7 months after he made the first chart modification we've identified in his federal contract history." He paused. "It's also 11 days after an anonymous tip was submitted to HHS about irregularities at one of the rural facilities. A tip we couldn't trace at the time." He looked at her steadily. "Ms. Carter, was that tip yours?" She held his gaze. "I submitted an anonymous report to HHS 11 months ago about a pattern of documentation irregularities I'd become aware of. I didn't have specifics about the federal facilities. I had a general concern." "That report triggered a records pull," Webb said, not looking up, "which Sloan's attorney somehow became aware of within 2 weeks, which is also 2 weeks before the first retaliation action against you appears in the Ravencrest HR file." The conference room went quiet in the specific way it does when people have just connected 2 things that explain a third thing they couldn't account for before. "He knew someone had reported him," Emily said. "He knew someone in his current facility had submitted something," Holt said. "He didn't know who, so he started eliminating people who might have done it," she said. "The float pool reassignments, the formal complaints. He was clearing the field. And you had the best documentation, which made you the most likely suspect, which made you the primary target." Holt closed his laptop. "Ms. Carter, I want to be transparent with you. The cooperation agreement Sloan's attorney filed this morning is incomplete. They're offering the federal contract fraud in exchange for reducing the Ravencrest charges to administrative violations. What they don't know, what they can't know yet, is that we have the access logs from Ravencrest EMR placing Aldis's credentials on 3 modified records." He paused. "Sloan's cooperation agreement doesn't mention Aldis.
which tells us Sloan is either protecting him or doesn't know we have the logs. Or both, Emily said. Or both, Holt agreed. In either case, the agreement as filed is built on a foundation that's about to crack. When Sloan's attorney finds out Aldis is implicated, the entire cooperation calculus changes, and that's going to happen. He checked his watch. Within the next 2 hours, when we formally notify Aldis that he's a subject of the investigation. Forsyth, who had been quiet through most of this, said, "What do you need from Ms. Carter?" A signed affidavit confirming the documentation she provided is accurate and complete, and a formal statement about the anonymous HHS tip. Holt looked at Emily. And possibly her presence at a federal hearing in 4 to 6 weeks, depending on how the cooperation negotiations resolve. "You'll have the affidavit today," she said. She signed it at 8:45 a.m. in the same conference room where she'd been offered a float pool position 20 hours ago. Webb notarized it. Forsyth made a copy. She kept one for herself because that was what you did when you had learned the hard way that paperwork only protects you if you have your own copy. At 9:15, the hallway outside the administrative suite became the most interesting place in Ravencrest Regional Medical Center. She wasn't there for the beginning of it. She was at the nursing station doing a chart review when she heard the doors from the administrative corridor open and the particular quality of movement that meant something had changed. She looked up. Graham Aldis was walking through the main corridor toward the ER. He was still in yesterday's clothes, and he had the look of a man who had not slept and had spent the pre-dawn hours on the phone with lawyers who kept telling him things he didn't want to hear. Behind him, at a professional distance, were Forsyth and a second OIG agent she hadn't seen before. They weren't escorting him, they were following him. There was a distinction, for now. Aldis came to the nursing station and looked at Emily. His face was doing something complicated that she read as the expression of someone who has been the decision-maker in a room for a long time and has just discovered they're no longer in that room. "Miss Carter," he said. His voice was controlled but thin around the edges. "Dr. Aldis. I've been advised—" He stopped, started again. "I wanted to—" He looked at Forsyth, who gave him nothing. He looked back at Emily. "I'm aware that my access credentials appear in the EMR logs. I want you to know that the modifications made under my login were made under duress. Sloan had documentation that he threatened to use against me personally, and I—" "Dr. Aldis," Forsyth said, gently but definitely. "I'd strongly advise you to have that conversation with your attorney present." Aldis stopped talking. He looked at Emily for another moment with the expression of a man who had hoped, on some level, that the nurse at the nursing station might somehow make this smaller for him. She looked back at him, and didn't. He went back toward the administrative corridor, and Forsyth followed, and the morning went on. Paul appeared beside her. "Did he just try to—" "Yes," she said. "What did he think you were going to do?" "I have no idea." She picked up the chart she'd been reviewing. "He's been in that office for 12 years. I think he expected it to still be his office." The day built in layers after that. The hospital's board of directors was called into an emergency session at 10 a.m. She knew because the boardroom was visible from the second-floor corridor, and she walked past it on her way to check a post-op patient and saw the tight cluster of faces around the conference table and the hospital's outside legal counsel at the head of it. Constance Park was in the meeting. She saw Emily through the glass and held her gaze for a moment, then looked away. Victor Sloan had been in the building all night. The investigators had requested he remain accessible, but at 11:30 a.m. he appeared in the main lobby with his attorney, a polished man named Kenneth Farr, who had the expensive suit and the deliberate calm of someone who charged by the hour and knew exactly what his presence communicated. They were leaving. Going, Emily assumed, to wherever the next phase of this happened. Attorney's office, federal building, the specific geography of a collapsing legal strategy. She happened to be crossing the main lobby on her way back from radiology when they came through. Sloan saw her from 15 feet away. His attorney put a hand briefly on his arm, the kind of touch that says, "Don't." Sloan stopped walking, and for a moment he just looked at her across the lobby of the hospital he had run for 8 years. She didn't stop walking. She didn't look away. She crossed the lobby the same way she'd been crossing it for 22 months. Direct, economical, no wasted motion. and went through the doors back to the ER. She heard behind her his attorney say something about the car. Then the lobby doors opened, and they were gone. At 12:30 p.m., Lieutenant Commander Bates came to find her. He was dressed in civilian clothes. Someone had arranged a change for the ambulatory operators, and he looked like a person who had slept 4 hours and decided that was sufficient. She was at the medication cart, and she turned when she heard him. "We're transferring the team to Walter Reed this afternoon," he said. "Military transport. Kowalski's stable enough for the move with appropriate medical support." Vance cleared him? 30 minutes ago. She's coordinating with the Walter Reed Neuro team. He paused. "I wanted to come find you before we left." She waited. "There are people who are going to want to write about what happened here," he said. "The military side, the investigation, it's going to come out in some form. I don't know what shape it takes, but I want you to know that whatever goes into the official record from our side is going to be accurate." "I appreciate that. I mean specifically, your role tonight. What you did for Reyes, for Kowalski, for all of them. I'm going to make sure it's in the record by rank, with context." He met her eyes. "You walked away from the Army 2 years ago, and I get that you had reasons. But those men are alive because of what you learned and what you kept, and that deserves to be in writing somewhere that doesn't disappear." She held his gaze. "Thank you, Bates." He nodded once. "The guys wanted me to tell you something. I'm told it's from Reyes specifically." He almost smiled. "They said, next time they're in a bad situation, they want the same trauma nurse. Tell them to try not to be in a bad situation. I'll pass that along." He extended his hand. She shook it. "Take care of yourself, Major Carter." He went. She stood at the medication cart for a moment after he left, letting the silence settle. The particular quiet that follows when the acute emergency is finally actually over and you're standing in what's left. The afternoon brought the board's decision in the form of a hospital-wide memo from the interim chief. Aldis had been placed on immediate administrative leave pending investigation, notifying staff that Ravencrest Regional was under active federal review and that all clinical staff should continue their duties normally and cooperate fully with investigators. The language was careful and revealed nothing, the kind of institutional communication designed to contain rather than inform. It didn't contain anything. By 2 p.m., everyone in the hospital knew the essential shape of it. 2 physicians implicated, federal investigators on site, a nurse whose documentation had started the chain. The staff processed this information in the way staff always process seismic institutional events, in small groups, in supply rooms, in the 2-minute conversations at the coffee machine that do more to establish the new reality than any official memo ever does. Emily became aware of being looked at differently in the halls. Not all of it was comfortable. Some of it was the admiring look she'd been getting since the previous night, which she had no idea what to do with, and so she did nothing. Some of it was the more complicated look, the look of people who were recalculating how much they'd missed and what they'd participated in and what that said about them. Terry gave her that look twice in the afternoon, and both times Emily just met it neutrally and moved on, because Terry had to work out her own accounting and Emily couldn't do it for her. One of the day shift nurses, a woman named Sandra, who had been at Ravencrest for 4 years and had, in Emily's experience, always done her job carefully and without drama, stopped her in the medication room at 3 p.m. "The nurses from before," Sandra said, "the ones who were floated out. Priya Nolan and James Harford. Do you know if the investigation is going to—" "I believe so," Emily said. "Their personnel files are part of the review." Sandra nodded. She was holding a medication tray and looking at the floor. "Priya was good," she said. "Really good. She left nursing entirely after Ravencrest, went to work for an insurance company." She paused. "James had a breakdown." Emily let that sit. "I filed a complaint 3 years ago," Sandra said. "About a different thing. It got dismissed. I let it go." She looked up. "I should have pushed harder." "You should talk to Forsyth," Emily said. "Today, if you can. Whatever you documented at the time, whatever you remember, it matters." Sandra nodded and went back to work. Emily wrote Forsyth a text flagging the conversation and left Sandra's decision to Sandra. That was all she could do. At 4:30 p.m., Forsyth came to find her with Holt. Both of them had the quality of people who have received unexpected information and are still working out what it means. They brought her back to the conference room, which at this point felt like a room she'd been living in for a week. "Sloane's attorney called," Holt said. "The cooperation agreement has been withdrawn." She looked at him. "They found out about Aldis." "They found out about Aldis and they found out about something else." Holt set his tablet on the table. "Our forensic team has been in the federal contract records all day. We pulled billing data from the 3 rural facilities where Sloane consulted. The billing pattern shows that he was submitting procedure claims for services that were not rendered. Not occasionally, systematically." He looked at her. "Over 5 years, the estimated federal billing fraud exceeds $2.3 million. The number sat in the room. "The chart alterations," Emily said slowly, "were to support the billing claims. When procedures weren't performed or outcomes were poor, the records were modified to show they had been performed or performed correctly. The record alterations weren't primarily about protecting his medical reputation. They were about protecting an invoicing structure." Holt's voice was flat. "3 patients died, Miss Carter. Our forensic medical reviewer believes that in at least 2 of those cases, the procedures billed and falsely documented as performed were procedures that, if actually performed, would likely have changed the outcome." She sat with that. She'd known, from the moment he'd told her about the deaths, that there was something worse underneath it. But understanding it abstractly and hearing it stated in those terms were 2 different things. "His attorney withdrew the cooperation agreement," she said, "because cooperating on the smaller version of this just made him more visible to the larger version, which is now a federal criminal investigation for fraud, falsification of federal records, and potential manslaughter charges depending on how the medical review resolves." Holt picked up his tablet. "Aldis's attorney has been on the phone with our office for the past 2 hours. Aldis is cooperating. He's providing a formal statement that Sloane presented him with altered records and told him that his signature, or in this case his access credentials, were necessary to finalize administrative compliance documentation. He claims he didn't know the context. Do you believe him?" Holt looked at her. "I believe he's telling the version that's most useful to him," he said. "Whether it's true depends on how much he actually knew, which is what the investigation will determine. His cooperation narrows his exposure. It doesn't eliminate it." Forsyth said, "There's one more thing." She waited. "The nursing director, Constance Park. She came to us at 2 p.m. voluntarily." He paused. "She had a document, original copy, physical paper, dated 14 months ago. It's an internal memo from Aldis directing her to dismiss any formal nursing complaints related to Dr. Sloane's clinical decisions without review. She kept it. She's been keeping it for 14 months in a locked drawer in her office." Emily stared at him. She had it, and she didn't. She said she was afraid. Forsyth's voice didn't editorialize this. He stated it the way he stated everything, as a fact to be processed. "She's cooperating fully now. The memo corroborates the systematic suppression of complaints and directly implicates Aldis in covering for Sloane." Emily was quiet for a long moment. "So Park had it the whole time," she said. "She had it," Forsyth said. "She didn't know what to do with it, and then she talked herself into believing she had to wait for the right moment, and then the right moment kept not arriving." He paused. "Until last night. She thought about all the things that 14 months could contain, the complaints that went nowhere, the nurses who left, the patients whose records said one thing and whose bodies told another story. She thought about Constance Park in a locked office with a piece of paper that could have changed the trajectory of all of it, deciding repeatedly to wait. She didn't say anything about that. It wasn't hers to say. Where does this stand now? She asked. Sloane will be arrested, Holt said. Probably within 48 hours once we finalize the charging documents. Federal charges, billing fraud, falsification of federal medical records, obstruction. The state medical board has already been notified and his license is suspended pending the outcome. He looked at her steadily. Aldis faces administrative charges and potential criminal exposure depending on his cooperation, and what the investigation determines, he actually knew. Park is a cooperating witness. He paused. And 3 other board members who were aware of the internal complaint suppression are going to have some difficult conversations with our office in the coming weeks. She looked at the table. Not in defeat. She was too tired for drama. Just taking it in. The full shape of it. 8 years of a structure held up by people making small, convenient decisions to look away, and now all of it coming down at once because one person hadn't looked away and had kept very careful records. "What happens to the hospital?" she asked. "It continues operating," Holt said, "with a federal monitor while the investigation completes. The board will appoint interim leadership. Clinical operations aren't affected." She nodded. She thought about the patients still in this building, about Reyes on his way to Walter Reed, about Gerald Whitmore, who was at home right now, recovered from a dissection that would have killed him if she hadn't pushed for the right diagnosis and then kept pushing, about Mia Sato, 7 years old, whose bacterial meningitis had been caught in time. She thought about the 2 nurses she didn't know, Priya Nolan, who had left the profession, James Harford, who had broken down, and the weight of that settled in her chest and stayed. "I have to ask you something," she said. Both men looked at her. "The patients at the rural facilities, the 3 who died, are there families who don't know yet what actually happened?" Holt was quiet for a moment. "That's part of what the investigation will address, notifying next of kin when causation is established." He paused. "It's not a fast process." "It needs to be part of the process," she said. "Not just the legal case, the families." "It will be," he said. And he said it in a way that meant he'd already thought about it, which was something. She stood up. Her back ached in the specific way that a 22-hour shift produces, and she'd been ignoring it for hours. "I'm going to finish my charting," she said, "and then I'm going to go home." "That sounds like a reasonable plan," Forsyth said. She was at the door when Holt said, "Ms. Carter, the affidavit you signed this morning, the documentation you provided, what you did, keeping all of that for 2 years while being the primary target of the person you were documenting." He stopped himself from wherever that sentence was going. He was a careful man, and he didn't finish it. "Thank you," he said simply. She stood in the doorway and looked at him. 3 patients died," she said. "I didn't have the federal contract information. I couldn't have known." She paused. "But I knew something was wrong, and I stayed and I kept documenting, and I've spent 2 years asking myself whether I should have done something faster or louder. I still don't know the answer to that." Neither of them had one for her. She hadn't expected them to. She went back to her patients. At 6:45 p.m., she was signing off on her final chart when Paul put a hand on the counter beside her and said quietly, "Look." She looked up. At the end of the corridor near the main entrance, Constance Park was walking toward the ER with the measured pace of someone who has made a decision and is following it through before she can talk herself out of it. She came to the nursing station and stopped in front of Emily and didn't say anything for a moment. Emily waited. "I was told you're finishing your shift," Park said. "Yes." "I wanted to—" She stopped, reconsidered whatever she'd planned to say. "The board's interim appointment will be announced Monday. In the meantime, nursing administration is operating under emergency protocols." She paused. "I'm recommending that your float pool reassignment be rescinded effective immediately and that you be reinstated to your original ER position." "Okay," Emily said. "There will also be a formal apology from this institution in writing. It will be in your personnel file, and it will be public." Park's voice was careful and without flourish. "It's not sufficient. I know that. But it's what I can do right now." Emily looked at her. Constance Park had kept a document in a locked drawer for 14 months. That was also true. Both things could be true at the same time. That she had waited too long, and that she had come forward eventually, and that the coming forward mattered. "Reinstate the other 2 as well," Emily said. "Nolan and Harford. I know Harford left. I know the reinstatement may be symbolic. Do it anyway." Park nodded. "I'll make that recommendation. And institute an anonymous clinical concern reporting system with external review. Not internal, external." Park looked at her for a moment. "That's going to require board approval. Then recommend it to the board." A long pause. "I'll put it in writing tomorrow," Park said. She left. Paul was quiet beside Emily for a moment. Then, "You know she's going to do it." "I know," Emily said. "It's in her interest to do it. That's okay. Good things can happen for complicated reasons." She finished her chart, closed her laptop, and stood up from the nursing station for the last time that shift. Her back still ached. She needed food and sleep, and probably, at some point, to sit somewhere quiet and let herself actually feel the weight of the last 22 hours without managing it for anyone. She picked up her bag. She was passing the entrance to the main lobby when she saw the man standing near the admissions desk. She stopped. He was in civilian clothes, well-worn jeans, a gray pullover, nothing that marked him as anything other than someone waiting for news about a family member. But his posture was wrong for that. Too controlled, too alert. The specific stillness of someone trained to look like they're not paying attention when they're paying very close attention. He wasn't military. She would have placed military in a moment. He was something else, and the something else tugged at a part of her memory she had not opened in a long time. He saw her looking, and he didn't look away. He reached into his jacket and produced a credentials wallet, opened it, and held it in a way that was readable from where she stood. Not OIG. Not HHS. The insignia on the credential was one she recognized from a briefing room at Fort Alden 4 years ago on a Tuesday afternoon when she'd been called in to consult on a situation that had been described to her as sensitive and had turned out to be something considerably larger than that. Defense Intelligence Agency. He crossed the lobby toward her at a measured pace and stopped 3 feet away and said, in a voice pitched for her ears only, "Major Carter, I apologize for the timing. My name is Garrett Norris. I've been in Stone Harbor since this morning." He paused. "I need to speak with you about something that isn't part of the OIG investigation, something that predates your time at Ravencrest by several years." Another pause. "Something that involves the classified mission your operators were running tonight when they were wounded, and a name that came up in our signals intercept 12 hours ago that I believe you're going to recognize." He held out a folded piece of paper. She took it, opened it. The name written on it in clean block letters was one she hadn't heard spoken aloud since Coast. Her hand was steady, her face was steady. But something behind her eyes went very still, in the way of a person who has just seen a threat she thought was over turn out to be something that never ended at all. She looked at the name on the paper for 3 full seconds. Then she folded it and put it in her jacket pocket and looked at Garrett Norris. "Not tonight," she said. He blinked. "Major Carter, I've been on shift for 23 hours. I've run a mass casualty event, provided sworn testimony to 2 federal agencies, and watched the institutional structure of this hospital begin to come apart at the seams." She kept her voice level. "Whatever this is, it will still be true tomorrow morning. I need you to give me until 9 a.m. He looked at her for a moment with the assessing expression of someone deciding whether to push. He decided not to. 9 a.m., he said. He handed her a card. "Call me when you're ready, and I'll come to you." She took the card and walked out of Ravencrest Regional Medical Center into the October night. The air was cold and smelled like the harbor, salt and diesel, and the particular coastal damp that Stone Harbor got in the fall. She stood on the sidewalk outside the ambulance bay for a moment and breathed it in. The night was quiet. The military vehicles were gone. The parking lot had the ordinary nighttime population of hospital staff cars, and one news van she noted at the far end, too far to bother her right now, probably waiting for someone to come out and say something quotable about the federal investigation. Nobody was going to come out and say something quotable tonight. She drove home. Her apartment was a 15-minute drive from the hospital, and it was the kind of apartment you rent when you're not sure how long you're staying. Functional, clean, not quite furnished enough to look like someone had fully committed to being there. She'd moved in with 2 suitcases and a box of books, and had added a decent coffee maker and not much else. She'd told herself for 2 years that she'd make it more of a home eventually. She hadn't gotten around to it. She ate a bowl of cereal because it was the fastest thing available, and she didn't trust herself to cook anything without falling asleep over it. She showered. She sat on the edge of her bed and took the folded paper out of her jacket pocket and looked at the name again, and then she put it on the nightstand and lay down. She was asleep in 4 minutes. She woke at 7:30 a.m. to 3 missed calls. One from Forsyth, one from a number she didn't recognize that turned out, when she listened to the voicemail, to be a reporter from the Stone Harbor Courier who had somehow gotten her personal number and was asking for comment on the federal investigation at Ravencrest Regional. She deleted that one. The third was from General Marsh, brief and to the point. Kowalski is stable at Walter Reed. Vance's surgical work held. Call me when you have a moment. She called Marsh back first because that was the one that mattered most personally. Good outcome, Marsh said when he picked up. I heard. Is he awake? Awake and complaining about the food, which Vance says is a good prognostic indicator. A pause. How are you? She considered the question while she made coffee. I met a DIA officer last night at the hospital, Garrett Norris. He had a name. She paused. A name from Coast. Silence on Marsh's end. Not surprise. He was too disciplined for audible surprise, but a specific quality of attention she recognized. What name? She told him. The pause that followed was longer. That's not possible, he said, and then, a beat later, or it wasn't, as of 2 years ago. His voice had shifted into the register he used when he was thinking out loud, which he rarely did, which meant this had genuinely caught him off balance. Norris is legitimate. I know the name. Stay close to him on this. I have a 9 a.m. meeting with him. Good. And Emily... He stopped himself. He almost never used her first name. It was the kind of tell a person like Marsh didn't usually allow. Be careful with what you know from Coast. You understand what I mean? Yes, she said. She understood exactly what he meant. She'd understood it for 2 years, and she'd been careful, and she would continue to be careful. I'll call you after. She hung up and drank her coffee standing at the kitchen counter, looking at the harbor through her window. The water was gray-green in the morning light, and a container ship was moving slowly toward the port. Ordinary Tuesday world, going about its business while the previous 36 hours existed in a category she hadn't fully processed yet and probably wouldn't for a while. She called Norris at 8:45, and he was at her door by 9:10 with 2 cups of coffee from the place on the corner, which she received as a reasonable gesture of good faith. They sat at her kitchen table, and he told her what the signals intercept had captured and what the DIA believed it meant, and she listened without interrupting, which was harder than it sounded because by the 4th minute she already had questions, and by the 8th minute she understood the shape of what he was describing well enough that the questions had sharpened into something more uncomfortable. The name on the paper was a man she had known at Kaost as a contractor, logistics officially, though his actual function had been something that logistics didn't quite cover. He had been present during an incident that had killed 2 soldiers and wounded 6 others, an incident whose official report had attributed causation to equipment failure. Emily had written a statement at the time that said the equipment failure was real, but that there were decisions made in the hours before it that had created the conditions for it, and that those decisions had been made by someone who knew what the risks were and had proceeded anyway for reasons that were not military. Her statement had been reviewed, filed, and never acted on. The contractor had left Coast 3 weeks after the incident and dropped out of any record she'd been able to access. What Norris was telling her was that the same man had appeared in signals intercepts connected to the procurement network that had been funding the classified mission Bates and his team were running when they were wounded, not as a target, as an intermediary. He's been active for 2 years, Norris said, working through private channels that cross multiple jurisdictions. What happened to Bates's team wasn't a random engagement. The mission was compromised from inside the procurement chain. She looked at her coffee. And you're telling me this because I'm in the incident report from Coast. I'm telling you this because your statement from Coast, the one that was filed and not acted on, is the earliest documented instance of this individual's involvement in something that caused direct harm to American military personnel. He paused. It establishes a pattern. It's potentially admissible as part of the evidentiary framework of the current investigation. She looked up at him. You need my statement from Coast to become part of a current DIA investigation. We need your cooperation, yes, your voluntary participation. She was quiet for a moment. She thought about the 2 soldiers who died at Coast and the 6 who were wounded and the official report that said equipment failure and the statement she had written that said something more than that. And the 2 years she'd spent in a hospital in Stone Harbor trying to want something smaller and quieter than the truth. I'll cooperate, she said. Norris exhaled. It was the first time he'd shown anything that wasn't controlled. Thank you. I need it formalized. I need a legal framework that protects me as a cooperating source, and I need the Coast incident report reviewed as part of this. Not filed again, reviewed, with someone who has the authority to act on what it says. I can arrange that. And the families of the 2 soldiers who died at Coast. If this investigation establishes what you're suggesting, it establishes that the incident wasn't purely mechanical failure. They need to know. Norris was quiet for a moment. That's a complicated ask. It's a non-negotiable one. She held his gaze. Those men have families who have been living with an equipment failure explanation for 4 years. If there's a person responsible, they deserve to know it. He nodded slowly. I'll take that to my director. Don't take it, she said. Make it a condition of my cooperation. There's a difference. He looked at her for a long moment. You're harder to work with than I expected. I've been told that, she said, usually by people who expected me to be easier than I should be. He left an hour later with her agreement to provide a formal statement and her conditions in writing. She closed the door and stood in her kitchen and looked at the harbor again and thought about the particular weight of things you carry for a long time before you find the right place to put them down. She went back to work. Victor Sloan was arrested on a Thursday, 9 days after the night the military helicopters landed. The arrest happened in the morning outside his house in the Stone Harbor suburb of Millbridge, and there was a photograph that ran in the Courier and then on the Wire and then on 3 national news outlets. A tall man in a gray sport coat with his wrists in front of him, looking at the ground, flanked by federal agents. The charges were read into the public record: federal healthcare fraud, falsification of federal medical records, obstruction of a federal investigation, and Foshin, after the forensic medical review completed, 2 counts of gross negligence contributing to patient death. His attorney issued a statement characterizing the charges as a misrepresentation of administrative complexity. It got 3 column inches. The photograph got the front page. Emily saw the photograph on her phone during a break and looked at it for about 10 seconds, and then put her phone away and went back to her patients. Graham Aldis resigned his position the same week, ahead of the board's formal removal proceedings. His cooperation with investigators had reduced his criminal exposure to a single count of falsification of records, for which he received a suspended sentence, a substantial fine, and a permanent bar from any administrative role in a federally funded medical institution. He sold his house in Stone Harbor and left. Nobody at the hospital marked his departure with anything in particular. Constance Park remained as nursing director through the transition period under the federal monitor's oversight. She implemented the external clinical reporting system Emily had asked for. She did it in writing, as promised, and the board approved it during the interim leadership period, which had the particular institutional logic of a body trying to demonstrate it had learned something before anyone formally asked them to prove it. It wasn't a flawless process, nothing real ever is. But the system existed, and it had teeth, and it wasn't run by the same people who'd had reason to make things disappear before. Priya Nolan's personnel file was corrected, and her record restored. She didn't come back to nursing, not to Ravencrest, and not elsewhere, at least not in the months Emily had visibility into. That was Priya's choice to make, and Emily respected it, though the waste of it sat uncomfortably in the back of her mind in the way of things you can't fix after the fact. James Harford contacted the hospital's legal team and received a settlement offer that, from what Emily understood through Paul, he accepted. He was in a better place, Paul said, which was the vaguest and most hopeful kind of information. 3 other nursing staff who had witnessed or reported irregularities and been dismissed or sidelined over the previous 5 years came forward to the investigation after the arrest became public. Their accounts were consistent and added detail to a picture that was already complete enough to be damning. One of them, a man who had worked nights and had been put on a performance improvement plan and then simply not renewed, called Forsyth directly after seeing the arrest photo and said he'd been waiting 2 years to do it. Sandra transferred her documentation of her own suppressed complaint to the OIG file and received a formal acknowledgement that it had been received and would be reviewed. She told Emily about it in the medication room, standing the way people stand when they've done something that cost them something and aren't sure yet how to feel about having done it. I should have pushed harder 3 years ago, Sandra said. Yes, Emily said, because she'd found that agreeing with a true thing was more respectful than softening it. But you came forward now. That counts. Sandra looked at her. Does it? It moved the record, Emily said. That's what counts mean. The DIA investigation took the shape that large classified investigations take. Slow, methodical, jurisdictionally complicated, happening in rooms Emily didn't have access to, and through processes she only understood in outline. What Norris had promised her, he delivered. Her co-statement was formally reviewed, the incident classification was amended, and a finding was entered into the official record that the equipment failure had been preceded by decisions made in the procurement chain that materially increased the risk of catastrophic failure, and that those decisions were made by a named individual with knowledge of the risk. The individual named was the man whose name had been on the folded paper. He was arrested in a European jurisdiction 14 weeks later through an Interpol coordination. Emily read about it in a brief she received from Norris's office, and then sat with it for a while. The particular feeling of a thing that had been wrong for 4 years finally being named and addressed, which was satisfying and insufficient in equal measure, the way justice always is when measured against what it's trying to correct. She wrote a letter. Not official, not for the record. A personal letter to the families of the 2 soldiers who had died at cost, through a channel Norris arranged that maintained appropriate boundaries. She didn't tell them details she wasn't authorized to share. She told them that the record had been corrected, that what had happened to their family members had been reviewed by people with the authority to change what it said, that it no longer said only equipment failure. She didn't know if the letters helped. She hoped they did. She sent them anyway, because not sending them felt like another kind of silence. General Marsh flew to Stone Harbor in December for a ceremony that Emily had tried, unsuccessfully, to have scaled down. The hospital board had requested it after the Federal Monitor filed his preliminary report, which included a specific passage about the role of nursing staff in identifying and documenting the institutional failures that led to the investigation. The board had read that passage and done what institutional bodies do when they need to demonstrate reform. They made a ceremony. She stood in the conference room, the same table, in her civilian clothes because she'd left the Army and she wasn't performing a return to it, and she received the acknowledgement from Marsh in the form of a letter of commendation that would be added to her military record, and a formal recognition from the hospital board that was read aloud by the interim CEO, and that used the phrase extraordinary professional integrity 3 times. Paul was in the room. Okafor was in the room. Sandra was in the room. Terry was in the room, standing a little away from the others with the expression of someone still working out the ongoing cost of looking away, which was honest and probably where she needed to be. Marsh shook Emily's hand. "The Coast Amendment," he said quietly, while the interim CEO was speaking to someone else. "It's in the record." "I know," she said. "Thank you for making sure it was right the first time." "I should have told you sooner." "You're telling me now." He nodded. He had the particular dignity of a man who accepts correction without deflecting it. She'd always respected that about him. After the ceremony, which ran 20 minutes shorter than scheduled because Emily had asked the interim CEO to keep it brief, Paul found her in the hallway. "Media's outside," he said. "I know." "You going to talk to them?" "No." He nodded as though he'd expected this. "The board's also asking about the trauma training program, whether you'd be willing to lead it." She'd heard this the week before from the interim CEO directly, a proposal to establish a military trauma training curriculum for Ravencrest nursing staff, drawing on her experience at Fort Alden. It was a good idea which she'd recognized immediately, and a complicated one, which she'd also recognized immediately, because accepting it meant committing to being here in a way that was different from the 22 months of careful, guarded presence she'd managed before. She'd thought about it for a week. "Yes," she said. Paul looked at her. "Yeah?" "It's a good program. The staff here needs it. And—" She paused. "Okafor is going to be a good doctor if she keeps going the way she went last month. She needs to know how to assess trauma she's never trained for. So does Terry. So does Sandra." She paused. "So did I once, before someone taught me." Paul was quiet for a moment. "Who taught you?" "A combat surgeon in Kandahar," she said, "who was also angry and tired and running on bad coffee, and who never once made me feel like asking a question was a waste of his time." She looked at the empty hallway. "I kept that. I've been keeping it for 12 years. She went back to the ER. She was at the nursing station at 4 p.m. when a courier arrived with a package from Walter Reed. Inside was a card signed by 5 people in handwriting that ranged from careful to nearly illegible. Reyes's signature was at the bottom with a drawing of something that was either a star or a very optimistic asterisk. The card said, "We don't say it enough to the people who deserve it. Thank you, Major Carter." She looked at it for a while. Then she put it in her scrub pocket and went back to work. The emergency department at Ravencrest Regional Medical Center looked the same as it had always looked. Same monitors, same medication carts, same fluorescent lights that were slightly too bright and slightly too cold. Same patients arriving with their ordinary crises, chest pain and lacerations and pediatric fevers, and the 1,000 variations of the human body asserting that something was wrong and needed attention. What was different was what happened when Emily Carter walked into the room. The staff moved differently. Not with exaggerated deference, not with performance. Something quieter and more functional than that. When she flagged a concern, people listened before they responded. When she documented something, it stayed documented. When she said, "I need a consult on this patient," the consult happened, and the physician who arrived already understood who they were talking to. It wasn't magic. It wasn't even always smooth. There were still days when someone made an assumption she had to correct, still moments when the old hierarchy tried to reassert itself through habit, if not through policy, still the ordinary friction of human beings trying to work together in high-pressure conditions. Okafor sometimes argued with her, which Emily took as a sign she was thinking correctly. Sandra second-guessed herself too often, which was its own problem that Emily was working on. Paul remained the most reliably honest person in the department, which she'd always known and had never said out loud and finally did, in the supply room on an unremarkable afternoon in January, at which point he looked profoundly uncomfortable for about 10 seconds and then recovered. She still made mistakes, nothing dramatic, nothing that cost a patient anything serious, but small errors, moments where she'd moved too fast or assumed too much, and she documented those the same way she documented everything else, because that was the point. Not perfection, the record, the honest, time-stamped, unalterable record of what actually happened. Victor Sloane's trial date was set for the following spring. His attorney had stopped filing motions to dismiss after the third one was denied. The federal billing fraud charges carried a sentencing range that his attorney was not optimistic about, which was information that came to Emily through Forsyth in the matter-of-fact way of a case that was moving through its process without needing her to do anything further for it. She received this information and filed it and didn't spend much time thinking about the trial because the trial was its own machinery now, and what happened there was determined by what she'd already done and what the investigators had built on top of it. She thought more about the 3 patients at the rural facilities, about the 2 whose deaths had been reclassified, about the third, whose death the forensic review had ultimately attributed to underlying pathology rather than the falsified records. A determination that felt like a narrow escape from something even worse, though it brought its own kind of grief for a family that would never know it had come that close. She thought about how long 8 years was. She thought about all the small decisions that accumulate into something monstrous when none of the people who could have stopped them at any one point decided to stop them. She thought, this is why you document. This is why you stay. This is why you don't let the room decide what you're worth. She thought about the nurses who'd come before her in that department and hadn't had 47 files on their phones because they hadn't been trained by the specific combination of war and loss, and a combat surgeon in Kandahar who modeled what it looked like to do your job exactly as well as it could be done and never once apologized for it. She thought, the next nurse who walks into this hospital needs something better to walk into. That was why she said yes to the program. The first trauma training session ran on a Wednesday morning in February with 9 nurses and 2 residents and Okafor, who had asked to participate even though residents weren't technically required to attend, and who sat in the front row with a notebook and the expression of someone who intended to use every minute of it. Emily stood at the front of the room and looked at them and thought about the combat surgeon in Kandahar for a moment, the way he'd walked into a training room like this one and treated every person in it as if they were capable of exactly as much as the situation would ever require. We're going to start with triage, she said. Not the textbook version.
The version that works when nothing is working right. She taught them the way she'd been taught, directly, without softening the edges, with the full weight of what it actually meant when you got it wrong left present in the room, rather than smoothed over into abstraction. She told them about Kandahar and about the protocols she'd built at Fort Alden, and about the night in October when 5 operators came through the ambulance bay, and what the difference was between the outcomes they got and the outcomes they might have gotten. She didn't make herself a hero in the telling. She wasn't one.
She'd been tired, and she'd made 2 decisions that night that were close calls. And she said so, because that was the honest version, and the honest version was the useful one. Okafor asked a question halfway through that was exactly the right question at exactly the right time. Emily stopped and answered it fully, because that was also something the combat surgeon had modeled. That a good question, the middle of a lesson, was not an interruption, it was the lesson working. After the session, when the room had emptied except for Paul, who'd stayed to help reset the space, he looked at her and said, "You're good at this." "I know," she said. He smiled at that. "You never used to say that." "I know," she said again. "I'm working on it." She picked up her materials and walked out of the training room and down the corridor toward the ER, where there were patients to see and charts to write, and a department that was still, imperfectly, and with effort and with occasional steps in the wrong direction, trying to become something better than it had been. She walked into the emergency department. Nobody laughed. Nobody looked past her. Nobody decided, in the 2 seconds it took to register her presence in the room, that she was the least important person in it. They just saw her, the way you see someone when you finally understand what you're looking at. The whole of her, the discipline and the anger and the grief and the competence and the 2 years of careful, unspectacular integrity in a building that had tried to spend her like she had no other value. And they made room. Not because they were required to, not because a ceremony had told them to, because she had been there the whole time, exactly who she was, and they had finally caught up. She thought, this is what it looks like when you stay. Not the ceremony, not the moment the helicopters land or the investigators arrive or the photograph of a man in handcuffs makes the front page. Those things matter, and they happened, and they were right. But they're not the point. The point is the 47 documents. The point is the night you go home and sit on your bed and wonder if you should have been louder, and then you get up the next morning and go back. The point is the 7-year-old girl who went home from the hospital and the 63-year-old man who went home from the hospital, and the 5 operators who went home from the hospital, and the nurses whose personnel files now say something different from what they said before. The point is that invisible is not the same as powerless. It never was. She walked to the nursing station, picked up her first chart of the shift, and got to work.